Thank you all for having me on. Really excited to be here with you all. I've heard great things about your network, and John has filled me in. Shame he's not here, but typical John to get busy at the last second and disappear. I'll be sure to give him a bit of a rough time when I do catch up with him. But I just want to maybe tell you a little bit about myself and about the union I represent in Australia. I work at the national office of the Transport Workers Union in Australia. So we are the union which covers road transport and aviation workers. Obviously the gig economy has rapidly expanded in the road transport industry in recent years. So it's a major issue for our union in the country. However, we are also a very active participant of the affiliate, I should say, of the International Transport Workers Federation, and have been really linked up through that peak union body internationally, with many great unions doing some incredible work in this space, and increasingly so. And I just probably acknowledge some of the work being done by unions like F&V in Europe, the IWGB, UGT in Spain. Happy to maybe segue at the end of this conversation into a discussion about some of the things coming out of your jurisdictions too, and I'll learn a little bit more about that. So to jump straight in, and apologies if this is a little bit basic for some, but just really important. I feel something that does get overlooked sometimes when we talk about the gig economy. We actually aren't just talking about rideshare or food delivery necessarily. We're increasingly describing an area of work which is expanding across countless industries. And we're talking about work which is very different across those industries. There's different levels of control, there's different issues for workers. In fact, the only thing which really ties all gig economy work together is that it's generally work that's mediated by some kind of a digital platform, so a phone application or an online website. It's generally work that involves circumventing the employment classification status. So it depends on these companies classifying workers as independent contractors, generally to circumvent labour laws, and it generally involves remuneration in a piecemeal rate system. So people are paid on a per job basis, and that's obviously going to shift the business risk onto workers increasingly as well. The industries we do see, at least in Australia, but I wouldn't be surprised if this is the same in many of the jurisdictions around the world in which you're based in as well. Already in Australia, we've seen gig economy work happening in the cleaning industry, building construction, of course, transport, where it's probably some of the earliest forms really started, teaching, hospitality, IT and design. I mean, most recently, it was just a couple months ago, I'd come across sex work apps in Australia as well. So there's almost no limits to where we're finding this model kind of really growing and expanding towards. And that's really important because, obviously we focus about the issues affecting transport because we've able to see what the advanced development of the gig economy in that sector, what implications it's really had. But this is really a crisis for the future of work altogether. And by no respects will be limited to the transport industry. But in terms of the effects in transport, so if you do want to see what the effects are, you look to transport because some of the earliest manifestations of gig economy work have actually occurred there. So here apologies, these are very, very Australian-centric representation and Australian-centric figures, but it wouldn't be too dissimilar from different patterns overseas. We saw first the emergence of ride-sharing apps, and this really marked in some ways one of the earliest manifestations of any kind of gig economy work. And that hit our shores in 2011, shortly followed by expansion of gig economy apps in the food delivery sector, the likes of Deliveroo, Menulog, Uber Eats, DoorDash, Just Eats, some of the major companies in that sector. And then last year we were hit by really a third wave in the transport industry, in the parcel delivery sector. So I'm sure everyone has at least heard of Amazon Flex, which is an Uber-style parcel delivery system, which is being rolled out by Uber at a really concerning pace. In the US, for example, they will become the largest transport operator in terms of parcels delivered every year by next year. So they will be bigger than the United Postal Service and bigger than FedEx, which is the largest unionized company in the US. And this is what working conditions from an Australian perspective look like. I'm conscious you probably don't know what the minimum wage in Australia is. It is based on award rates. It should be about roughly 25 Australian dollars per hour for a casual worker in these industries, plus or minus 10%. This is what our latest survey is telling us people are getting paid after cost in these sectors. So substantially below minimum wage. In fact, in food delivery, less than half. But of course, we've always seen in the transport sector, and of course this would be true for others, that when you really intensify work through low pay and by depriving workers of minimum rights and conditions, you create really unsafe working arrangements. There's a direct correlation between really tightening the screws on people working on our roads and having them push themselves to the extent where they literally are more likely to die or be seriously injured or killed. And of course, if that happens in the gig economy, there are no insurances in place to protect or care for people or care for loved ones who've lost someone when those terrible things happen. And they are happening. These different photos are all collected from just a few weeks last year. In Australia, there was, in the space of 6 weeks, we lost 5 workers just in the food delivery industry. Absolutely tragic. It shocked the nation. It made headlines internationally at the same time. And in all these cases, we saw people in those same arrangements working for $10, $12 an hour, working 80-hour weeks in order to compensate for those low rates of pay, working that extra bit faster and pushing themselves to the limit because they're scared that they could be terminated by an algorithm without any right to an appeal or a due process if they deliver an order too slowly, for example. And it's important to note that this relationship is not just one we observe in the food delivery sector. As I said, it's always been around in the transport sector, but we have seen in the emerging gig economy a really new low for exploitation, and with that a new high for just how unsafe and how tragic some of the safety situation has become in certain parts of the road transport sector. In terms of what we have been doing broadly as a union, I mean, our campaign really started in Australia in 2018. I think, and this, you're not already having acknowledged some of those great unions in different parts of the world, but generally the approach from unions has been not to be proactive in the gig economy space. I think there is a wide awareness about the risks and challenges it poses. And really the threat to workers and working conditions. But logistically, a lot of unions have been daunted by the task of really tackling this head on. There are huge challenges to organising with workers being fragmented and isolated through app-based applications and spread out with no central meeting point, and how unions can even start to overcome those challenges when we've already struggled so hard with insecure and non-standard forms of work to date. And then there's this question about how do we even, in addition to that, start that process when we can't rely on the existing industrial relations frameworks because these workers are classified as contractors and we don't even have access to formalized bargaining structures or anything like that. So really recognizing those challenges, the 2 primary goals for us were to do these 2 things, was to create a regulatory model which will deliver substantive rights and conditions to all workers in the gig economy. No one gets left out, no company gets left behind. Our approach and our thinking in Australia is quite unique. I know I'll come to that a little bit towards the end, and happy to take some more questions on that. In terms of organising, we have tried a few different things, and by no means by no stretch of the imagination have we solved the organising puzzle in the gig economy, but we've had some really, I think, great success in recent years. In terms of broadly pursuing regulation, and I won't go into too much detail into each of these things, but we have been really successful, I think, more broadly as a union in deconstructing what was a really vicious narrative, which permeated through the Houses of Parliament, through our media institutions, even through think tanks and academia in the early days, through policymakers as well, and advisors. That said, that this was a utopia. It wasn't too long ago. I know it seems ridiculous and funny now that when people talked about the gig economy, they said, well, actually, this is a really positive thing. This is going to empower people. This is going to provide a means for people to be their own boss, to unleash the entrepreneurial spirit in a way that really takes us into a new age, almost a post-worker age. And we've, in the space of the last 2 years, and many unions have contributed to this internationally, have been really, I think, most powerfully able to really deconstruct that narrative and expose the endemic and systemic exploitation that really underpins a lot of the arrangements which exist in the gig economy today. And that's been borne out through, we've had our legal test cases here. We've had a number against Deliveroo and Uber Eats. Some are ongoing, some continue. We have had a number of inquiries. We are struggling with a conservative government here federally, so actually getting things, substantive regulation and intervention off the back of the recommendations released has been challenging, but we're working with a couple different state governments on regulatory frameworks within states at the moment, and those talks are really progressing and starting to show a lot of promise. And we have been, where we can, using our existing industrial strength within our traditional transport sector, and the agreements we have with economic employers, but also major transport operators, to really block out the expansion of the gig economy, or where it does exist, lift standards where we can as well. This is the stuff which I'm a lot more excited in talking about. It's the actual organising piece in this. There are a couple things which I might just say contextually are important when understanding organising in Australia. Some of these do generally overlap with other jurisdictions, some don't. We have mostly focused on food delivery organising, just because that's where we saw the bastion of exploitation and the most severe forms of exploitation occurring in Australia. However, of course, there's a need to focus on every subsector in which it's expanding, mostly a resource issue, and we just kind of really had to focus our limited resources in that area. However, we have seen some really exciting success since we have done that. A couple points in the food delivery sector in Australia, 85% are temporary migrants. So there are workers on visas, and they're mostly student visas or working holiday visas. So we're in some ways organising a migrant workforce just as much as we are a gig economy workforce. That's really important in some of the strategies and approaches we've taken to organising those workers. There have been challenges, obviously, with fragmentation and isolation, which I've spoken about. They're obviously very consistent across the world and across the gig economy. There has been particular needs for gig economy workers in the food delivery sector, specifically around safety. There has been a particular vacuum of rights, any kind of institutional rights or protections. So we've gone and been creative in some respects to use and identify legislative frameworks where we can actually empower workers in the course of organising. And if they're the problems, in terms of some of the strategies we've really applied to those problems, you will, and I think anyone who's ever had any experience organising migrant workers will find that, and sadly so a lot of the time, but understandably, any worker who migrates to a country on a temporary visa is often much more concerned with their visa or immigration status than their working conditions. And to the point where they are willing to, suffer and even if they're well aware of their rights and working conditions, be subject to certain forms of exploitation because, they're working for a better day and a better future, and they're aspirational, and that can be a really beautiful thing as well. And it's very sad that certain systems and arrangements and companies and employers, when migrant workers migrate, really exploit that to their benefit. And that's really the story of what's happening in the gig economy. So what we've done with that is, as a union, we've started to offer immigration support services to food delivery workers. It's been incredibly successful. We find that by helping people who are migrating here get some security around their visa and immigration status, they are more likely to become workplace activists and unionists, and at the same time start to fight exploitation within their workplace. In terms of addressing the gap in legislative rights, we are really blessed in Australia, and this is incredibly specific to Australia, in that our industrial laws are generally really designated by whether you're an employee and you get everything, or you're an independent contractor and you get nothing. However, in terms of safety, that's not the case. So our safety laws consider a worker as a worker, regardless of what artificial label you put on them, if you call them a contractor or you don't. And because of that, they actually are able to access consultation representation rights. They're able to access to elect their own health and safety representatives with huge powers to enable bargaining, to enable companies to ensure their primary duty of care, to address safety matters, which has really helped us build delegate structures, steward structures in Australia in and around that piece of legislation. We have seen our, bread and butter organising campaigns in and around, industrial disputes at specific companies. I'm going to play a video in a second from one earlier this year involving a workforce which 95% spoke no English. It was a Chinese food delivery gig economy app. And I would have probably said it was impossible to see them organise, and they ran a really inspiring campaign at the beginning of this year and won in the gig economy against what was a really vicious company at the time. And then we've really doubled down on different digital organising strategies, obviously to really deal with that issue of overcoming fragmentation and connecting workers in isolated spaces. I'll just stress, never a panacea, digital organising. It is a very important tool, but not a silver bullet. But it has been an incredibly important one in the context of the gig economy and organising the food delivery sector. And then through the ITF, we've had some great solidarity across borders. We were involved in a Deliveroo IPO campaign at the beginning of this year, where we were able to have workers taking action across 8 of the 9 jurisdictions in which Deliveroo operates in, all at the same time as it was floating. And if you hadn't heard, it was one of the most disastrous floats we've ever seen in recent years. And I think they floated at something like 30% below expectation and cost the company billions of dollars. So forms of really international solidarity in campaigning, which has really lifted the organising efforts in Australia, and I know has done so in other jurisdictions. Okay, let me see if I can get this working.
Fed up and frustrated, delivery riders for Hungry Panda have been railing against the company led by the Transport Workers Union.
Hungry Panda has treated these workers like a disposable underclass. This is not the way the Australian community expects workers in our country to be treated.
The company is under intense scrutiny after the death of Sydney rider Jia Chen in September last year, hit by a bus while delivering food. Then a pay cut among riders this month, and now allegations of unfair dismissal. It's the beginning of a long day for Hungry Panda rider Sun Feng, or Leon as he's known. He's become one of the company's outspoken critics. 7:30 spent some time with Leon and discovered it's a cutthroat business. The orders appear on an app, but disappear within seconds as other riders compete for the same jobs. Within moments, Leon takes 2 orders, riding between restaurants and customers around inner Sydney. Each job is about $9, a bit less, he says, than what he used to earn.
Before the pay cut, I used to get around $11 per order.
Leon has to be extra careful because Hungry Panda doesn't provide any insurance if he dies or is injured on the job. Leon is vowing to keep up his fight.
Everyone, including me, is very disappointed in Panda's pay cut. They should restore it to the previous level.
The union is now filing an unfair dismissal claim against Hungry Panda on behalf of 2 other riders who say they were blocked from the app after speaking up.
在抗议之后，我收到了很大的。
After the protest, Hungry Panda retaliated against me. They immediately expelled me from my job. I feel really helpless.
Relief for food delivery riders after winning their workplace battle. Last month, riders Jun Yang and Shangtian Li were removed from the food delivery platform Hungry Panda. The men claimed they were unfairly dismissed after protesting against changes to their pay rate, even taking their fight to the Fair Work Commission. After weeks of negotiations, the decision was reversed, and the riders say they'll be reinstated on better pay.
今天收到了上午
I received a call from Hungry Panda today. They said I'll get my job back within the next 2 days and a new agreement will be signed.
The Transport Workers Union hopes that more gig economy companies will step up to ensure better working conditions for other riders.
We call on Uber Eats, we call on Deliveroo, we call on Easy and others to join us in this fight to lift standards.
To ensure everyone has a fair go.
加入工会以来，感受到这个工会的对我们这个工人的资助非常大，不管是各方面，从精神上面来说是非常的可取的。我希望就是没有加入我们运输工会的所有工人都加入进来，因为他会这个资助你的一些所需所以说希望大家这个积极的参加。
希望所有行业的那些工人们都可以踊跃积极的成为工人代表、工人领袖，因为工人领袖真的是一个非常荣耀的一个职位，甚至一个领袖地位。这个如果说都可以争着积极的当工人领袖的话，那么这个社会将不会再有压榨。Union Power, Union Power， 工会给力，工会给力。
Just to maybe give some quick context with that specific campaign. So those workers last year, they lost one of their co-workers, Zhao Chen, who was killed without insurance, without any support, without any really accountability or care from the company at all. Just another number on an app. His wife had flown over at the time, was offered very little support by the company, and we kind of crowdfunded for her. 4 months after that death, the company had slashed wages and conditions again by 30%. And they were already incredibly low, and people were already pushing themselves to the edges. When those two workers got up and said something about that, and this is really common in the gig economy, they were terminated. They were sacked. Really our role as a union was coming in and just connecting the dots between groups of workers who are naturally self-organising, and that's ideally what you'd like to see when you have those situations really occur, and then just watching those workers lead a really brave campaign over the course of 6 weeks where they reversed the pay cut, had an injury insurance arrangement introduced for all workers across the country, had a collective representation structure set up for them. I mean, didn't solve all the issues, but a huge improvement and a huge victory for those workers. And also, I mean, it still baffles me. I can't for the life of me picture being in a country where I didn't speak the language, and then literally turning up and being on the front of every TV station the next day in a really high profile campaign outside the company you work for whilst you're on a visa protesting is just an incredible amount of courage. I am conscious I'm probably coming up against time. Just briefly, in terms of what it is we're fighting for, what the regulatory model looks like, just a few passing comments. Generally, in the approach of unions and many around the globe has been to specifically focus on employment status as we went forward. And generally, the approach of companies has been to undermine that by trying to create a third classification of worker with substandard inferior rights. Obviously, we incredibly, very strongly oppose the third way, as we call it. And I know in the UK, for example, there is a struggle at the moment with that third way, and there's been some policy taken up by the UK Labor Party over there to sort of move beyond the limitations of that Lim B worker status. And it's for those reasons we really oppose it here. Our approach, though, is not solely based on employment. We support expanding the employment definition so we can capture more people as workers. However, that, in our experience, we've been a union which has represented owner drivers who have been contractors for 150 years, and we have created regulatory models which have regulated the entire spectrum of work. So not just everyone who falls on this side and we classify as an employee, but saying everyone's a worker and everyone deserves rights. And there should be an institutional structure in place for the union when work is organised to be able to access fair rights and entitlements. And the benefit of doing that is it doesn't rely on a common law test at court or a definition which multinational corporations can circumvent. It creates a standing capacity for minimum rights and entitlements to be carried across at any time, and an institutional mechanism for making that happen. So that's the broad kind of model we're really pushing for in Australia. It's quite a unique model, and I'm happy to provide a bit more information about that if you guys are interested. I might just stop there. So the Rideshare Drivers Network is a group which is one of a few self-organised groups for rideshare drivers in Australia. They are a group we resourced and supported as a union. As I kind of mentioned, we focused on food delivery, but our approach in rideshare was to, we noticed there were self-organised groups, rather than come over the top of them, really try to support and build them up and support the work they were already doing. We had a really good relationship with them for over 2-3 years, and over at the end was just a we couldn't see eye to eye on how to have a joint membership structure, and they kind of off the back of that decided to go it alone and went off on their own. And I mean, we still do work closely with them, and we whenever they kind of ask for things, we do support them and try to resource them as much as we can. But yes, they've since kind of charted their own route, and they have recently announced a court case off the back of that. So they are doing some good things in Australia, but they are, that's their kind of their short history. And in terms of your second question, the regulatory model, yes. I've tried, geez, I could talk about this for half an hour, but I'm sure you probably need a few more drinks if I started to. So in New South Wales, in the most populous state in Australia, we have an existing system for owner drivers, which we set up because we've always had this issue where you have, self-employment used to undermine employment, and this, race to the bottom, and wherever you find there's lower standards, capital will shift production into whatever side of the category it is. And of course, if a tradition as a union, if we just focused on getting people to employment status, these companies would devise new ways to get them back into self-employment. So we found strategically the best approach we really had was to create a system with the capacity to say, no, it doesn't matter what artificial label you slap on a worker, they are a worker. And that's really useful because you're absolutely right, Joe. Sometimes workers come back and say, for whatever reason, we don't want to be employees. And then we can turn around and say, well, that's fine, but you're not a business and you want rights. And the answer to that's yes. And then you get back to union organizing and our bread and butter and building power and getting better rights and conditions. And so how that's worked in New South Wales is we've got a system which creates minimum standards for categories and classes of workers on a sectorial basis in just the same way it would have happened on the employment side. So it does it through setting minimum contract standards, which includes minimum rates, conditions, insurance, provisions, access to leave entitlements, whatever the right or condition that people think they should have and want to fight for, does that across an industry. It makes sure that at a minimum, there is the minimum labour component rates or equivalent plus cost recovery for all their business expenses, and then provides them access to collective bargaining on top of that. And it provides, this is the irony, is that the Conservatives in this country have spent so much time undermining our employee mechanisms that this side of it for the union is actually much easier to organise in at the moment, because we get a lot easier access to yards, to workers. They have greater powers. They have, for example, it's easier to strike on this side than it is on the employment side, and to exercise collective power. So for all those reasons, that's kind of why we really emphasise the need to regulate the entire spectrum of work and really move past labels. However, sometimes that's conflated with a third way, and it's really important to distinguish that. A third way isn't saying that we recognise all workers as workers. A third way is saying we recognise some workers as lesser workers, and we're going to legislate to ensure they receive inferior rights and conditions. That's a very, very different thing. So in terms of how to organise migrant workers, I mean, I don't think we are doing anything that can't be replicated in that respect into other jurisdictions. The most important thing we find is really being patient in building trust with migrant worker groups and not just transposing traditional conceptions of how we organise workers into those groups. So you've often really got to work hard at really educating migrant workers who are in a new context about who you are and how how things might not be necessarily fair or just at the moment. And in some ways that you have to do that by actually not having that conversation in the first instance and talking about their most immediate needs and conditions. So that's what we've kind of we've done, I think, in the context of Australia. I know we're not alone. I mean, some unions have been really doing some great work in this space in other parts of the globe. But really just coming back to it, it's just focusing on, not making assumptions about the needs of workers. And, sometimes they are more so at the beginning a migrant worker than they are a gig worker. And you've got to approach them in that respect, if that makes sense. And I think that we've had success when we've done that. In terms of negotiating with state governments, I don't think our governments are any more receptive or progressive than any of the governments around the world, particularly our Labor ones. But look, it's there is an element of negotiating and really making the case and presenting the research and showing the severe exploitation and prosecuting the argument and building the public support. But there will come a point, and I know we're in a position where we'll potentially have to do it in one of our states shortly, is that we will need to give governments, even if they're progressive governments, a push in order to get the change we need to see, because it is transformative and it is going to shake up the interests of a lot of multinational corporations. And we never have been a union which kind of thinks we can sit on our hands and just rely on governments to deliver outcomes for us just because they're right or good. There is a really concerted attempt in and around negotiating, even with Labor governments, in ensuring that when they do not act, we are taking action and really using different points of leverage over different governments to make sure they're delivering the change we need to see. Our convoys are the favourite for the TWU, so you guys have heard it here first. But look, we're in a position now, Queensland government at the moment where they're looking to introduce a very similar system to New South Wales, which I just described, but one that would potentially capture gig in the same way. That there was a commitment to do that, and we're already seeing certain government officials peel away from that. So there's talk about a mass convoy in the coming months if we don't have really them deliver on that, which will include the entire road transport industry, essentially coming out on the roads, trucks, buses, couriers, vans, to really prosecute the case industrially for that kind of government intervention. Yeah, and it's a really good question. That's in effect what I mean. Those conditions on the offer of work are really implied when you regulate the non-employment side, because the offer of work is really offering a contract to a potential contractor, and so when you regulate that arrangement, then the people who are handing out contracts become accountable for the standards they set. But to take that at the extreme, I actually neglected this when I was talking about regulation. It's a really important part is to make sure the offer of work, as you've put it, Tim, that the people offering work are accountable through supply chains. So that we have someone offering transport work at the top of a supply chain, and then subsequent parties contracting out, making sure that the main offerer, what we call the economic employer, is still accountable by the time that the work actually is offered down at the final step, in be it from the platform or from another company. Such a timely question. I was at a presentation today by the peak body of unions here, the Australian Council of Trade Unions, and that very situation is happening with our seasonal migrant worker program. So we have a seasonal worker system for Pacific Island nations who bring workers over to work on some of our agricultural parts of our agricultural industry and fruit picking, and like terrible, really exploitative conditions, similar to gig work in some ways. and have that exact arrangement with the union in the Pacific Island countries. Samoa was one of them, and a partnership with the relevant union here, where every worker gets a briefing before they leave the country and gets put in contact with their worker before they arrive here. And that really just completely changing the situation for workers once they arrive, and really cracking open that really systemic exploitation in that industry. Unfortunately for us, one, at least in the Chinese food delivery sector, I'll use that example, a lot of those workers come from China. Some are from Malaysia, some are from Taiwan, but it's predominantly China. And we're not finding that it's a little bit hard when you have general migration streams, because you have people coming over to work in all kinds of industries. So how you manage that as a specific union in a specific industry, you wouldn't know which union to reach out with to start, if that makes sense. I think there's a space for our peak union bodies to play that kind of role with other peaks in really kind of guiding newly arrived migrants into their respective unions upon arrival. The reason it works obviously in the agricultural industry, because that's a specific migration program, which is funneling workers directly from that industry in the Pacific Islands into that industry here in Australia. But I think you're absolutely right that that's really what we need to see, particularly in the migrant worker space, more collaboration between unions in countries where people are migrating from and to. Yeah, no, it's a really great question. And I mean, insecure work is just such a great thing to focus on, because it really cuts across so many sections of the working class in modern day Australia. We have obviously hyper insecurity in the gig economy, but we've seen long forms of insecurity, even affecting employee segments through increasing casualisation, through labour hire arrangements. And I mean, it's the same case generally throughout many developed countries. So shifting that conversation to focus on insecure work, which is a kind of a universal right across that spectrum that people want as well, because even when you get those really conservative workers who say they want to remain their own business and retain control, job security is one of the things that they'll just inevitably, there'll be a consensus position on that it is important and it is something they should be fighting for, and they need security around their contract in terms of engagement. So I think it's a deeply widely felt issue. I think we're seeing it's a very contemporary one, given the manifestation of the gig economy, in addition to those long-standing forms of precarious, insecure work we've seen in the employment side. We talk like the traditional, but it's really taken hold in the last couple of decades. And it's just it's the gig economy in some ways is us just telling that real story about growing insecurity through the workforce more broadly. It's also a great issue for us to focus on as unions, because it has probably been the one most single factor which has led to the demise of unions, is really the fact that capital has been able to make the work arrangement so fleeting and so precarious, has really circumscribed our ability as unions to sustainably organise workers in different parts of our different jurisdictions. So, sorry, John, I'm not sure that was much of an answer, but a lot of reasons I think to be focusing on job security. Obviously, incredibly important issue. It's deeply widely felt, and we're seeing a real kind of strong manifestation of that in the gig economy. What a great point, because I think it definitely captures our experience of this too, Colin. We've seen contracting arrangements which long predate the gig economy we've seen it, those kind of practices amongst musicians, and actually some great work being done on that front by the relevant union here in Australia as well. But I mean, even for us, the gig economy isn't new. We've always had truck drivers who generally, own their own truck, are on ABNs, or in self-employed arrangements. And what's really new about the gig economy is it's taken this to a new extreme. It's really blown up the scope and the depth and the penetration by which the self-employed arrangements are able to exist and permeate. And so I think we've always seen sections of the workforce, like we have with musicians, really deal with some of those same problems, which now we're just seeing a much larger group of the workforce increasingly have to deal with. The same forms of insecurity, lack of work rights, lack of protections, lack of access to collective bargaining and union representation. Yeah. Couldn't agree more. I mean, every organization should be accountable for the standards in their contracting networks or supply chains. That makes every single one of them a target. And we know that, economic power in our economies is only concentrating. So those targets are becoming few and larger. So plenty of work to be done through supply chains in really raising the issues of gig economy exploitation and really getting companies and people to act really against those issues. I think we would agree with that here. What we've had is there's been some manoeuvring around competition laws to provide gig economy workers recently in Australia the ability to bargain, but effectively they have no capacity or power to bargain. So it's being used as a kind of smokescreen to say, oh, look, we've solved the problem here by, dealing with the competition law impediments, but effectively and practically it's done nothing. So this really does need to be approached, I think, from the conceptual lens of we're providing workers with rights and entitlements. And I think when you do that, and I think you're right, the way you approach it is really instructive and important in that process. You'll get the outcome we need to see, and that's not just limited to competition law. And we have signed a memorandum of understanding with one of those cooperatives which have just set up in Sydney. I'm a big supporter of the model. However, practically, I think we really, I think, have to recognise that you won't solve the issue of gig economy exploitation solely. I can see you're not, of course, I know you know this, but sometimes our faith will get lost in the cooperative snare through the growth of cooperatives. And I think it's unrealistic to expect that a cooperative model will eliminate market share of Uber or some of these big corporations. But absolutely, they're great, a great concept and vehicle in organisation. What we've tried to do is actually couple the growth of that cooperative with the union in a way that allows us to build power at the same time as it grows, and then use that organisational power to target some of the other parts of the industry and some of those other really bad multinational corporations. That sounds really nice, what I've just described, but it's very early days and we're still figuring that out. But yes, it is something we've looked at here. I think the first part of that was on regulatory frameworks. Completely agree, and you know really well, John. it's not about creating a minimum standard and then just leaving that to workers and backing out. Of course, we've seen plenty of workers in really impoverished arrangements on minimum standards and minimum conditions. Why? Because they're not empowered, and there's not a structure in place to really enable that and create the conditions for unions and workers to build that power and that source of empowerment. So when we design, when we talk about regulating the gig economy, it's not about just saying here are the minimum standards and these are the conditions, but a framework which actually supports the work of unions and the work of workers in organising, and really is premised almost on the creation of that industrial strength in checking the power of capital. John, sorry, remind me that there was two more parts of that question. I got so carried away in that answer, I've forgotten them. Most definitely is stuff happening. I can see Ireland, absolutely, France, absolutely, all through parts of Europe, also in Brussels, and there are different union groups and networks I can put people in touch with if they're like to get a bit more involved in their local jurisdictions. That most of that work's being coordinated at the moment in the food delivery industry through the ITF. I know the ITUC's had some involvement too. Tola, I'm not sure if you want to come in and add anything on top of that, but I'm happy to link people in. In terms of dates, internationally, there's nothing on the horizon, but happy to loop people in as certain things come up. We are due to reconvene after our Deliveroo IPO campaign, and I think there's some appetite for targeting Uber as a next point. So watch this space. Everyone, I'm really sorry. I actually do have a call at 8:30 with a worker who's I couldn't get a hold of during the day. So if it's okay, I'll leave you all. Thank you so much for having me, and I hope to cross paths with you all soon. I've dropped my email in the chat box if anyone would like to follow me up about anything.